The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the quiet neighborhood. Birds chirped softly in the trees, and the air carried the faint scent of blooming flowers. It was one of those mornings that felt perfect, peaceful, calm, and full of promise. For Captain Evelyn Monroe, it was a rare moment of solitude. A decorated officer in the city's police department, Evelyn didn't get many days off. Her career had been marked by hard work, determination, and countless sacrifices. But today, she decided to take a break from her responsibilities and enjoy the simple pleasure of a morning walk. Evelyn lived in a modest house on a tree-lined street. She loved her neighborhood for its charm and sense of community. As she stepped outside, she pulled on her favorite hoodie, slipped into a pair of comfortable sneakers, and set off down the sidewalk. The world seemed so different when viewed at this slower pace. Without the weight of her uniform or the pressures of command, Evelyn felt almost anonymous. No one passing by would guess that this woman with a warm smile and relaxed demeanor held one of the highest ranks in the police force. As she walked, Evelyn noticed small details she often overlooked in her busy life. The way the sunlight danced on the dew-covered grass, the laughter of children playing in a nearby yard, the rhythmic sound of her own footsteps against the pavement. These little things brought her joy, reminding her why she worked so hard to protect people and their communities. Still, even in these peaceful moments, Evelyn couldn't completely escape the realities of her job. Over the years, she'd faced challenges most officers never encountered: prejudice because of her skin color, skepticism about her abilities as a woman, and the constant pressure to prove herself in a male-dominated field. Yet, through it all, she remained steadfast, earning respect not just as a leader, but as a symbol of resilience. Unbeknownst to Evelyn, someone else was watching her too. Officer Derek Hale, a rookie cop known for his short temper and questionable judgment, was patrolling the area. From his car, he spotted Evelyn walking casually along the sidewalk. To him, she didn't fit the profile of someone who belonged in this neighborhood. Her casual clothes, her relaxed posture, everything about her seemed suspicious to him. Without taking a moment to think, Hale decided to investigate further. He slowed his vehicle and rolled down the window, his eyes fixed on Evelyn as if trying to solve some invisible puzzle. What Hale failed to see, or perhaps chose to ignore, was the humanity of the person in front of him. Instead of recognizing Evelyn as a neighbor enjoying her morning, he saw only what his biases told him to see: a potential threat. Little did he know, his decision to approach her would set off a chain of events neither of them could have anticipated. For now, though, Evelyn continued her walk, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing behind her. The serenity of the morning still clung to her like a comforting blanket, shielding her, for a little while longer, from the harshness of the world beyond. The sound of tires screeching against the pavement broke the tranquility of Evelyn's morning walk. She turned her head just in time to see a police cruiser pull up beside her, its red and blue lights flashing unnecessarily in the calm neighborhood. Confused, Evelyn stopped walking and waited, wondering why an officer would approach her on such a quiet street. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing Officer Derek Hale. His expression was stern, almost accusatory, as he leaned out of the car. "Excuse me, ma'am," Hale barked, his tone far from polite. "What are you doing in this area?" Evelyn blinked, taken aback by the sudden intrusion. She had lived here for years, knew every corner of this neighborhood, and yet this stranger was questioning her presence as if she were an outsider. Still, she kept her composure, responding calmly, "I'm just taking a walk. I live around here." Hale frowned, clearly unconvinced. "You live here? Where exactly?" he pressed, his voice sharp and dismissive. Evelyn pointed toward her house, which was only a few blocks away, right down the road. "Why do you ask?" Instead of accepting her answer, Hale grew more suspicious. He stepped out of his cruiser, slamming the door behind him with unnecessary force. His tall frame loomed over Evelyn as he approached her, his body language aggressive and intimidating. "Do you have ID on you?" he demanded, ignoring her earlier explanation entirely. At this point, Evelyn felt a flicker of frustration, but pushed it aside. She reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out her wallet, ready to show him identification that would clear up any misunderstanding. But before she could even open her wallet, Hale cut her off. "Don't move too quickly," he snapped, resting his hand on the holster of his gun. The gesture sent a chill through Evelyn's spine, not because she was afraid of him, but because she couldn't believe how quickly the situation had escalated. "I'm not reaching for anything dangerous," Evelyn said firmly, trying to keep her tone measured despite her rising irritation. "I'm just getting my ID to show you." But Hale wasn't listening. His mind seemed made up, fueled by assumptions that had nothing to do with facts. "This is a nice neighborhood," he remarked coldly, as though implying she didn't belong. "People don't usually dress like that around here." Evelyn looked down at her clothes, jeans, sneakers, and a plain hoodie, and then back at Hale. Was this really what this was about? Her appearance? She took a deep breath, reminding herself not to let anger take over. "Officer, I assure you, I live here. My name is Evelyn Monroe, and if you'll let me show you my ID, we can resolve this quickly." But Hale wasn't interested in resolving anything. He crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing as though daring her to try something. "Step back from the wallet," he ordered, raising his voice now so it carried across the street. A few neighbors peeked out of their windows, curious about the commotion. One older woman opened her front door slightly, watching with concern. By now, Evelyn realized that reasoning with this man wouldn't be easy. There was something deeper driving his behavior, something rooted in bias rather than logic. Still, she tried one last time. "Look, officer, I understand you're doing your job, but there's no reason for this level of suspicion. I'm a resident, and I've done nothing wrong." Her words fell on deaf ears. Hale stepped closer, his face inches from hers. "If you're truly who you say you are, then prove it," he growled. "Otherwise, I need you to come with me." Evelyn's heart sank. This wasn't just about mistaken identity anymore. It was about power and control. And as much as she wanted to stand her ground, she knew arguing further might only make things worse. So she nodded slowly, deciding to comply. For now. But deep inside, a fire began to burn. This wasn't just an attack on her. It was an attack on everything she stood for. Justice, fairness, and equality. And Evelyn Monroe wasn't someone who backed down when faced with injustice. The tension between Evelyn and Officer Hale reached a boiling point as he continued to escalate the situation unnecessarily. Despite her calm demeanor and repeated attempts to explain herself, Hale's behavior grew more aggressive by the second. His tone was sharp, his movements deliberate, and his body language screamed hostility. To anyone watching, it was clear that this wasn't just a routine stop. It was something far more personal. Evelyn, still holding her wallet in one hand, decided to take control of the situation. She knew she couldn't reason with Hale at this moment. His mind seemed closed off to anything she said. But she also knew she had the power to end this quickly if he would simply listen. "Officer," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around her. "I am Captain Evelyn Monroe. I work for the same department you do. Let me show you my badge." For a split second, Hale hesitated. The mention of her rank caught him off guard, but instead of pausing to process what she'd said, his instincts took over. When Evelyn moved slightly to open her wallet and retrieve her badge, Hale lunged forward, grabbing her wrist with surprising force. "Don't reach for anything," he shouted, his voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby homes. Neighbors who had been peeking out of their windows now stepped onto their porches, phones in hand, recording the scene. "What are you doing?" Evelyn demanded, trying to pull away from his grip. Her patience was wearing thin, and frustration bubbled beneath the surface. "I told you, I'm a captain in the police department. You're making a huge mistake." But Hale wasn't listening. In his mind, he had already painted Evelyn as a threat, someone who needed to be subdued no matter what. Without warning, he twisted her arm behind her back and shoved her against the hood of a nearby car. The cold metal pressed into her chest as he struggled to handcuff her. Each movement felt humiliating, not because Evelyn was afraid, but because she couldn't believe this was happening. Not here, not now, and certainly not to her. By this time, a small crowd had gathered. Some people gasped in shock, while others called out to Hale, urging him to stop. "What are you doing? She's not resisting," one man yelled. Another neighbor, an elderly woman clutching her phone, shook her head in disbelief. "This is wrong," she muttered under her breath, capturing every detail on video. Evelyn, though restrained, refused to let fear or anger consume her. Instead, she raised her voice so everyone could hear. "My name is Captain Evelyn Monroe," she declared loudly, ensuring her words carried across the street. "You can verify my identity at the precinct. This is unacceptable behavior, Officer Hale." Her declaration caused murmurs among the onlookers. A few recognized her name. After all, Captain Monroe was well respected within the community. They began whispering to each other, pointing out that Evelyn was telling the truth. One teenager even shouted, "She's right. That's Captain Monroe. Everyone knows her." Despite the growing chorus of voices supporting Evelyn, Hale remained unmoved. He tightened the handcuffs, ignoring the discomfort it caused her, and barked, "You'll have your chance to explain yourself at the station." It was as if he believed he could silence the truth by sheer force of will. As Hale opened the door to his cruiser, preparing to place Evelyn inside, she locked eyes with him. There was no fear in her gaze, only determination. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she said quietly, her voice laced with quiet authority. "And when this is over, you'll regret every decision you've made today." Hale froze for a moment, perhaps sensing the weight of her words, but he quickly shook it off, pushing her into the back seat of the car. As the door slammed shut, Evelyn sat upright, her jaw clenched. She wasn't defeated. Far from it. If anything, this injustice fueled her resolve. She knew the system she dedicated her life to would hold Hale accountable, and she vowed to make sure this moment became a turning point, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced discrimination at the hands of someone sworn to protect them. The ride to the precinct was tense and silent, except for the occasional crackle of the police radio. Evelyn sat in the back seat of the cruiser, her hands cuffed behind her, staring straight ahead with a composed expression that masked the storm brewing inside her. She replayed the events of the morning in her mind, the unnecessary suspicion, the aggressive behavior, the blatant disregard for her authority. It wasn't just about what had happened to her. It was about how this incident reflected deeper issues within the system she had devoted her life to serving. When they arrived at the precinct, Hale led Evelyn inside, his grip firm on her arm as though she were some dangerous criminal. The moment they stepped through the doors, however, everything changed. Officers who had been chatting casually or typing reports froze mid-action, their eyes widening in disbelief. Whispers rippled through the room like a wave. "Is that Captain Monroe?" someone muttered. Another officer dropped his pen in shock, while a few others exchanged uneasy glances. Lieutenant Marcus Reed, one of Evelyn's closest colleagues and a trusted friend, was among the first to react. He stood up from his desk, his face a mixture of confusion and anger. "What's going on here?" he demanded, striding toward Hale and Evelyn. His voice carried an edge that made even Hale flinch. Hale stammered, suddenly less confident than he'd been during the arrest. "Sir, I pulled her over because she seemed suspicious." She resisted. "I did not resist," Evelyn interrupted sharply, cutting him off before he could spin more lies. Her voice rang out clearly, silencing the murmurs around them. "I identified myself as Captain Evelyn Monroe multiple times." This officer refused to listen. Marcus turned to Evelyn, his brow furrowed with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, his tone softening. When she nodded, he motioned for another officer to remove the handcuffs immediately. As soon as her hands were free, Evelyn rolled her shoulders, wincing slightly at the lingering ache, but refusing to show weakness. "Show me your badge," Marcus said firmly, addressing Hale now, "and explain why you detained a senior officer without cause." The demand hung heavy in the air, and Hale fumbled nervously, pulling out his own identification. By this point, the entire precinct was watching, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Evelyn reached into her pocket and retrieved her wallet, flipping it open to reveal her captain's badge. The golden emblem gleamed under the fluorescent lights, leaving no room for doubt about her identity or rank. A collective gasp echoed through the room as the truth became undeniable. Some officers looked away, ashamed. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Hale's face turned red, whether from embarrassment or anger. It was hard to tell. "I didn't know," he began, but Marcus cut him off. "You didn't know?" Marcus repeated incredulously. "You're telling me you couldn't take 2 seconds to verify her identity? Do you have any idea who Captain Monroe is? What she's done for this department?" Evelyn stepped forward, her presence commanding respect even without her uniform. "This isn't just about me," she said, addressing the room. Every eye turned to her, hanging onto her every word. "It's about accountability. If this can happen to me, a captain in this very department, what does that say about how we treat ordinary citizens? How many others are being mistreated because of bias or arrogance?" Her words struck a nerve. Murmurs of agreement spread throughout the room, and several officers nodded solemnly. Even those who hadn't always seen eye to eye with Evelyn couldn't deny the validity of her statement. This wasn't just a personal grievance, it was a systemic issue that needed addressing. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "We'll handle this properly," he promised. Turning to Hale, he added sternly, "You're suspended pending investigation. Report to Internal Affairs immediately." As Hale slunk away, his head bowed in shame, Evelyn exhaled deeply. The initial shock of the ordeal was wearing off, replaced by a mix of emotions. Anger, frustration, but also determination. She glanced around the room, meeting the gaze of each officer present. They weren't just colleagues. They were part of a team entrusted with protecting the community. And today, Evelyn realized she had an opportunity to push for change, not just for herself, but for everyone counting on them to do better. The fallout from the incident spread like wildfire, igniting conversations far beyond the walls of the police precinct. Within hours, footage of Evelyn's arrest, captured by neighbors on their phones, was circulating online. Social media platforms buzzed with outrage as people watched the video, frame by frame, witnessing the injustice unfold. Comments poured in from all corners of the city, condemning Officer Hale's actions and demanding accountability. For many, the clip was a stark reminder of the systemic issues plaguing law enforcement: racial bias, abuse of power, and a lack of trust between officers and the communities they served. Local news outlets picked up the story quickly, turning it into a headline that dominated the evening broadcasts. Journalists described Evelyn as a respected leader within the department, highlighting her years of service and dedication to reforming policing practices. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Here was a woman who had spent her career fighting for justice, only to become a victim of the very biases she worked tirelessly to dismantle. Protesters began gathering outside the precinct, holding signs that read "Justice for Captain Monroe" and "Bias has no place in blue." Their chants echoed through the streets, drawing attention not just locally but nationally. For Evelyn, the public scrutiny was overwhelming. She appreciated the support but felt uneasy being at the center of such intense attention. Still, she understood the importance of using this moment to spark meaningful change. When Lieutenant Marcus Reed suggested holding a press conference to address the situation, Evelyn agreed, but only if she could speak directly to the community. She wanted her voice to be heard, not filtered through lawyers or public relations teams. The day of the press conference arrived, and the room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing like strobe lights. Evelyn stood tall at the podium, flanked by Chief Daniels, and other senior officials. Her presence commanded respect, even in the chaotic atmosphere. As she began to speak, the room fell silent, every ear tuned to her words. "What happened to me isn't unique," she said, her tone measured but powerful. "It's a reflection of larger problems we need to confront as a society. Bias doesn't just hurt individuals. It erodes trust, divides communities, and undermines the principles of fairness and equality we claim to uphold." She went on to describe the morning of her arrest, recounting how Officer Hale's assumptions overshadowed basic professionalism. Her account was calm yet unflinching, painting a clear picture of what transpired without resorting to anger or blame. "I've dedicated my life to protecting and serving," she continued, "but I can't do that alone. Change requires all of us, officers, leaders, citizens, to hold ourselves accountable and demand better from one another." Her speech resonated deeply, earning applause from some attendees and nods of agreement from others. Reporters fired questions at her, probing for details about the investigation and potential reforms. Evelyn answered thoughtfully, emphasizing the need for transparency and training programs focused on addressing implicit bias. She also called for stronger oversight mechanisms to ensure incidents like hers wouldn't happen again. Meanwhile, the internal investigation into Officer Hale revealed troubling patterns. Fellow officers came forward with stories of similar behavior: unnecessarily aggressive stops, dismissive attitudes toward minority residents, and a general disregard for protocol. These accounts painted a damning portrait of an individual unfit to wear the badge. Some admitted they'd stayed silent out of fear of retaliation, while others simply hadn't realized the extent of the problem until now. As the days passed, pressure mounted on the department to take decisive action. Community leaders joined forces with advocacy groups to draft proposals for reform, including mandatory de-escalation training, body cameras for all officers, and independent review boards to handle complaints against law enforcement. The momentum was undeniable, fueled by Evelyn's courage and the collective outcry of those demanding justice. Though progress felt slow, Evelyn remained hopeful. She knew real change wouldn't happen overnight, but she believed in the power of persistence. Every interview, every meeting, every conversation brought them closer to a future where no one would have to endure what she had. And as she left the press conference that day, surrounded by supporters and colleagues, Evelyn carried with her a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to turn pain into progress, not just for herself, but for everyone counting on her to lead the way. In the days following the press conference, Evelyn found herself caught between two worlds. On one side was the public spotlight. Interview requests flooded her inbox, community leaders sought her advice, and strangers approached her on the street to express their gratitude. On the other side was the quieter, more personal struggle she faced behind closed doors. The incident had shaken her deeply, not just because of what Officer Hale had done, but because it forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about the institution she loved. One evening, after a long day of meetings and media appearances, Evelyn sat in her living room with Lieutenant Marcus Reed. They were close friends, and Marcus had been a steady source of support throughout the ordeal. He leaned forward in his chair, concern etched across his face. "How are you really holding up?" he asked softly, cutting through the silence that had settled between them. Evelyn sighed, rubbing her temples as if trying to ease the weight pressing down on her. "Honestly, Marcus, I'm exhausted," she admitted. "It's not just about me. It's about everything this represents. Every time I think about how easily things could have gone differently, how many others might not have had the same outcome." Her voice trailed off, heavy with emotion. Marcus nodded, understanding the depth of her frustration. "You've always been the strongest person I know," he said. "But even the strongest people need to rest sometimes. You don't have to carry all of this alone." She managed a small smile, appreciating his kindness. Still, Evelyn knew she couldn't afford to step back. Not yet. There was too much at stake. The department was under intense scrutiny, and while some officers supported her, others resented the attention the incident had brought. Whispers circulated in the hallways, questioning whether Evelyn's case was an isolated event or symptomatic of deeper issues. Some argued that punishing Hale would be enough. Others insisted that real change required overhauling policies and attitudes at every level. Determined to push forward, Evelyn threw herself into advocating for reform. She met with Chief Daniels regularly, proposing initiatives like mandatory bias training, stricter accountability measures, and partnerships with community organizations. At first, progress felt agonizingly slow. Resistance came from unexpected places. Even colleagues who claimed to support her balked at the idea of sweeping changes. "We can't fix decades of problems overnight," one senior officer argued during a heated meeting. "These things take time." Her persistence paid off gradually. The department announced new training programs aimed at addressing implicit bias, and committees were formed to review use of force policies. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers, ensuring transparency during interactions with the public. While these steps weren't perfect solutions, they marked a turning point, a commitment to doing better. Despite these victories, Evelyn couldn't escape moments of doubt. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the world seemed distant, she replayed the arrest in her mind. What if she hadn't been a captain? What if no one had filmed the encounter? Would anyone have believed her? These questions haunted her, reminding her that privilege and rank had shielded her in ways unavailable to so many others. One particularly tough night, Evelyn called her sister, Lisa, seeking comfort. Lisa listened patiently as Evelyn poured out her fears and frustrations. When Evelyn finished, Lisa spoke gently but firmly. "Evelyn, you're allowed to feel angry. You're allowed to feel hurt. But don't let those feelings stop you from doing what you do best, fighting for what's right. This isn't just your story anymore. It's a chance to make things better for everyone." Her words struck a chord. Evelyn realized that while the journey ahead would be difficult, it was also an opportunity, a chance to leave a legacy of courage and resilience. She thought about the young officers who looked up to her, the community members who trusted her, and the countless individuals counting on her to lead by example. If she gave up now, she'd be letting them all down. The next morning, Evelyn returned to work with renewed determination. She walked through the precinct with her head held high, greeting colleagues with warmth and professionalism. Though scars from the incident remained, both visible and invisible, she refused to let bitterness define her. Instead, she channeled her energy into building bridges, fostering dialogue, and proving that change was possible. And as she stood in the hallway, watching officers interact with newfound awareness and accountability, Evelyn felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in weeks, she believed it might lead somewhere worth reaching. Weeks turned into months, and the investigation into Officer Derek Hale reached its conclusion. The findings were damning: a pattern of discriminatory behavior, multiple complaints from citizens that had been ignored, and a blatant disregard for protocol during Evelyn's arrest. Facing mounting evidence and public pressure, the department made its decision. Hale was formally charged with misconduct and terminated from the force. It was a victory, but Evelyn knew it wasn't enough to erase the damage he had caused or the systemic issues his actions highlighted. The fallout didn't stop there. Community leaders, activists, and even some within the department pushed for broader reforms. Chief Daniels announced a series of sweeping changes designed to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. Body cameras became mandatory for every officer, not just as a tool for transparency, but as a safeguard against abuse of power. Training programs were revamped to include modules on implicit bias, cultural sensitivity, and de-escalation techniques. Additionally, an independent oversight board was established to review complaints against officers and ensure accountability. While these measures marked significant progress, not everyone was satisfied. Critics argued that the reforms were superficial, mere band-aids over deep-rooted wounds. Protesters continued to gather outside the precinct, demanding more drastic action. such as reallocating funds to social services and implementing stricter hiring standards. Evelyn understood their frustration. She too believed that true change required going beyond policy updates and addressing the underlying culture of policing. Despite the criticism, Evelyn remained steadfast in her commitment to reform. She took on a leadership role in overseeing the implementation of the new initiatives, working closely with community organizations to ensure their voices were heard. Her presence at town hall meetings and panel discussions became a source of hope for many. People saw her not just as a victim of injustice, but as a leader determined to turn pain into progress. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, Evelyn found herself reflecting on how far they'd come and how much further they still had to go. She sat in her office, surrounded by stacks of reports and proposals, when Lieutenant Marcus Reed walked in. "You've done more in 6 months than most people accomplish in a lifetime," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Take a moment to appreciate that." Evelyn smiled faintly but shook her head. "Appreciating it won't make it stick," she replied. "Change isn't something you can set and forget. It's ongoing work, Marcus. If we stop pushing now, everything we've fought for could slip away." Her words carried weight, especially given the challenges they faced daily. Some officers resisted the reforms, grumbling about unnecessary bureaucracy or claiming the new policies made their jobs harder. Others paid lip service to the initiatives without truly embracing them. Evelyn knew that changing hearts and minds would take time, and patience she sometimes struggled to muster. Still, there were signs of progress. Younger officers, eager to learn and adapt, approached Evelyn regularly for advice. They admired her resilience and sought guidance on navigating difficult situations fairly and respectfully. One rookie, Officer Daniels, told her, "You're proof that doing the right thing matters, even when it's hard." Moments like these reminded Evelyn why she kept fighting. As the months passed, Evelyn also began receiving letters from people she'd never met, ordinary citizens sharing stories of encounters with police that had ended differently because of the reforms. A mother wrote to thank her for helping create a system where her teenage son felt safe reporting an issue instead of fearing retaliation. An elderly man described how an officer had taken the time to listen to his concerns, something he said wouldn't have happened before. Each letter reinforced Evelyn's belief that no effort was too small if it led to meaningful impact. By the end of the year, the department was beginning to see tangible results. Complaints against officers dropped significantly, and surveys showed increased public trust in law enforcement. While Evelyn knew there was still much work to be done, she allowed herself a rare moment of pride. The journey had been long and painful, but together they had started building something better, not just for themselves but for future generations. And as Evelyn stood on the steps of the precinct one chilly morning, watching the sunrise paint the sky in hues of gold and pink, she felt a quiet sense of hope. The road ahead remained uncertain, but she was ready to face it, one step at a time. Months after the incident that had shaken her to her core, Evelyn found herself standing on a stage under bright lights, surrounded by applause and admiration. The city's annual awards ceremony was in full swing, honoring individuals who had made significant contributions to justice, equality, and community service. Tonight, Captain Evelyn Monroe was being recognized not just as a decorated officer, but as a symbol of resilience, courage, and leadership. As she walked up to accept the award, Evelyn took a moment to soak in the atmosphere. The room was filled with colleagues, community leaders, friends, and even some strangers whose lives had been touched by her story. Cameras flashed, capturing every step she took. When she reached the podium, the applause grew louder, echoing through the grand hall like waves crashing against a shore. Evelyn paused, letting the sound wash over her before raising a hand to signal for quiet. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady yet warm. "This honor is humbling, but it doesn't belong to me alone. It belongs to everyone who stood with me during one of the hardest moments of my life, and to those who continue to fight for justice every single day." Her words resonated deeply, drawing nods of agreement from the audience. She went on to reflect on the journey that had brought her here. The morning walk that turned into an ordeal, the public outcry that followed, and the tireless work of so many people determined to turn pain into progress. What happened to me wasn't unique, she said, her tone firm but compassionate. It was a reflection of larger problems we can no longer ignore. But it also showed me something beautiful, the power of unity. When we come together, officers, citizens, leaders, we have the ability to create real change. Evelyn's speech wasn't just about looking back. It was about looking forward. She spoke passionately about the reforms implemented within the department and the growing trust between law enforcement and the community. We've taken steps, yes, but our work isn't done. True justice requires constant effort, honesty, and accountability. It demands that we listen, learn, and grow, not just as individuals but as a society. Her closing remarks earned a standing ovation. As she stepped away from the podium, holding the award in her hands, Evelyn felt a mix of emotions. Pride, gratitude, and determination swirled inside her, reminding her of how far she'd come and how much further she still wanted to go. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn continued to inspire others. Her story became a beacon of hope for marginalized communities, proof that speaking out against injustice could lead to meaningful change. Schools invited her to speak to students about perseverance and integrity. Community centers hosted workshops inspired by her advocacy efforts. Even other police departments reached out, seeking guidance on implementing similar reforms. But Evelyn didn't let the accolades distract her from her mission. She returned to work each day with the same dedication that had defined her career. Walking through the precinct, she noticed subtle but important shifts in the culture. Officers greeted residents with respect, listened more intently, and approached situations with greater empathy. Rookie officers often stopped by her office to ask for advice or share their experiences, eager to follow in her footsteps. At home, Evelyn found solace in simple pleasures, a cup of tea on her porch, phone calls with her sister Lisa, and long walks through her neighborhood. These moments reminded her of the importance of balance, of finding peace amid chaos. Yet even in these quiet times, her mind never strayed far from the bigger picture. She knew the fight for equality and fairness would always require vigilance, and she was ready to meet that challenge head-on. Years later, when historians wrote about this period, Evelyn's name would appear alongside those who had paved the way for reform in law enforcement. Textbooks and documentaries highlighted her courage, her leadership, and her unwavering commitment to justice. But what mattered most to Evelyn wasn't the recognition, it was the impact. The young girl who dreamed of becoming a police officer because of Evelyn's example. The elderly man who felt safe reporting a concern without fear of retaliation. The rookie cop who chose kindness over aggression because he remembered Evelyn's teachings. As she looked out at the horizon one evening, watching the sun dip below the rooftops of her beloved neighborhood, Evelyn allowed herself a rare smile. The scars of the past remained, but they were reminders, not of pain, but of strength. She had faced adversity and emerged stronger, using her voice to uplift others and her actions to drive change. And though the world was far from perfect, Evelyn knew she had played a part in making it better.